If the Scandinavian countries are capitalist, why not adopt their policies? Yet, if they are socialist and still successful, doesn't that challenge the idea that socialism always leads to failure? This argument, however, is a false dichotomy and an oversimplification. Economic freedom exists on a spectrum, and countries can adopt policies that reduce economic freedom without becoming completely socialist with community ownership of all the means of production. For example, it is not as if raising the top federal income tax rate to 45% would make the United States a completely socialist country, even though it would decrease economic freedom. Conversely, if a country had government ownership of all the means of production, but then privatized a small industry, that would not mean it suddenly became a capitalist country, nor would it mean that it remained 100% socialist. Instead, we should view countries as being more or less economically free, while recognizing that there can sometimes be shorthand utility in referring to them as socialist, communist, capitalist, etc. Another problem with the line of questioning mentioned earlier is that democratic socialists seem to want the United States to adopt only the policies of Scandinavian countries that decrease economic freedom. As a result, the proper response to the two questions could be the following. Question 1. If the Scandinavian countries are capitalist, why not adopt their policies? Response: because the policies you want to adopt are the ones that reduce economic freedom, and thus reduce the extent to which the Scandinavian countries can be considered capitalist. Question 2. If they are socialist and still successful, doesn't that challenge the idea that socialism always leads to failure? Response: to the extent that they can be considered successful, this is in spite of their policies that decrease economic freedom, not because of them. They would undoubtedly be more productive if they became more economically free by reducing the high taxes levied by the government. In short, the crucial distinction to make is that when democratic socialists talk about making the United States more like Scandinavia, they are almost never referring to adopting policies that increase economic freedom, such as eliminating the federal minimum wage, which none of the Scandinavian countries have. Instead, democratic socialists tend to advocate only for the Scandinavian-style policies that would reduce economic freedom, such as higher taxes, Medicare for all, and making public universities tuition-free. So while it is true that all 5 Nordic countries score higher on Heritage's index of economic freedom than the United States does, it is not true that adopting the policies supported by the democratic socialists would make the United States more economically free. Having made that clarification, let's examine what might be deemed the Scandinavian trade-off. For one, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden all have much higher taxes than the United States. Denmark's tax revenue as a percentage of GDP exceeded 45% in 2021. Norway and Sweden were not far off, each with tax revenues exceeding 40% of GDP. In contrast, the United States collected less than 30% of its GDP in tax revenue. Unsurprisingly, when the government offers more services or benefits at no direct cost to consumers, it usually has to pay for them by raising taxes. It is also not as if these taxes are only placed on the so-called rich. Daniel Boone, Sean Bray, and Joost Haddinga's 2023 article for Tax Foundation, titled Insights into the Tax Systems of Scandinavian Countries, explains how the higher top personal income tax rates in Denmark and Sweden do not only apply to who most Americans may think of as the rich. Quote, Scandinavian countries tend to levy top personal income tax rates on upper middle class earners, not just high-income taxpayers. For example, Denmark's top statutory personal income tax rate of 55.9% applies to all income over 1.3 times the average income. From a U.S. perspective, this means that all income over $82,000, 1.3 times the average U.S. income of about $63,000, would be taxed at 55.9%. Norway and Sweden have similarly flat income tax systems. Norway's top personal tax rate of 38.2% applies to all income over 1.5 times the average Norwegian income. Sweden's top personal tax rate of 52.3% applies to all income over 1.1 times the average national income. In comparison, the United States levies its top personal income tax rate of 43.7%, federal and state combined, at 8.5 times the average U.S. income, at around $530,000. Thus, a comparatively smaller share of taxpayers faces the top rate. End quote. The article also rightly points out that all 3 Scandinavian countries have a 25% value-added tax, which is a consumption tax levied on the value added to goods and services at each stage of production or distribution. In contrast, the United States has no national value-added tax or sales tax. It's also worth pointing out that the 1% don't have enough wealth to fund Democrats' dreams. Consider universal health care, for example. According to Q2 2025 Fed data, the top 1% of U.S. households held $51.86 trillion in wealth. If all of that were confiscated tomorrow and earned 5% interest every year, you still wouldn't be able to fund universal health care on the interest alone. Total U.S. healthcare spending in 2023 was $4.9 trillion. In 2025 dollars, using the PCE, that would be about $5.1 trillion. 5% interest on $51.86 trillion would amount to only about $2.6 trillion, roughly half the total spent on healthcare annually in recent years. So over time, you would eventually spend down the principal, and you'd have to look elsewhere for funding. At such a time, it would be hard to imagine that enough wealth would be concentrated in the top 1% to perform another confiscation to fund universal healthcare for much longer. After all, why would people save and invest if they expect their wealth to be confiscated in the future? Spreading the confiscation over time, such as through a 10% annual wealth tax on millionaires or billionaires, has similar problems, as it lowers people's incentive to produce, save, and invest. It's also morally wrong, since theft by democracy is no less immoral than theft by an individual, but I digress. It would be great if declaring healthcare, food, and housing to be human rights made the scarcity of doctors, medical innovations, beef, and single-family homes disappear, but that's not reality. Pretending we can abolish scarcity at the stroke of a pen will only hurt us. It is far better to acknowledge that we live in a world with limited resources that have alternative uses and act accordingly. To wrap up, if you want the U.S. to adopt Scandinavian social programs such as universal health insurance, you should be willing to acknowledge the higher taxes that would accompany them. The goal of this post was not to evaluate the merits of each and every social program the Scandinavian countries have, but rather to point out that we should not ignore the trade-offs those programs would likely entail. If you want to know my thoughts on single-payer healthcare, you can read or watch my recent blog post titled, quote, "The Bad Economics of Single-Payer Healthcare."